Hello everyone, my name is Jerice Barrios, and I'm the Archivist for the North American province of the Cenacle. Today I'm going to be talking to you about the history of the Cenacle Sisters and the National Lay Women's Retreat Movement. The full title of my presentation is Co-Creating a World Renewed, Cenacle Sisters and the National Lay Women's Retreat Movement. And I chose the title of World Renewed because Woman Renewed, World Renewed was the theme of the 1968 Congress of the National Lay Women's Retreat Movement, which I will refer to as NLRM from now on. This was an organization the Cenacle Sisters helped to found in 1936. It was a true example of a collaboration between lay women and women religious. The NLRM worked to promote the role of the retreat in helping people reach a fuller and more meaningful connection to God. This talk will trace the history of the NLRM by telling the stories of some of the Cenacle sisters who were key figures in the movement, as well as the lay women who were co-laborers in the retreat apostolate. This cooperation between Cenacle sisters and lay people can serve as an example for the Ministry of Retreats as it moves forward into the new realities of current times. Before we jump into talking about the history of the NLRM, I wanted to give a couple of acknowledgments. There were a few histories written by lay women that were great resources in writing this presentation. In 1956, Bertha Brown wrote a history about the first 20 years of NLRM, from 1936 to 1956. Ms. Brown had served as secretary of NLRM in 1939 and as president in 1943. In 1977, Alice Hunt wrote Remembering, her memories of the beginning of the NLRM. Ms. Hunt had been a retreat captain under the guidance of Sister Helen Clifford in the 1930s and served as a president of NLRM in 1946. Also in 1977, Gloria McEntee, the historian for NLRM, wrote a report detailing the history of the organization to date, so up till 1977. At the time that she wrote her history, the men's and women's lay retreat movement had merged to form Retreats International. So we start out with the beginnings of the Cenacle in North America, just briefly tracing that. So here our first slide shows an early community at St. Regis and then the buildings of St. Regis. And this was the first retreat house in North America for the Cenacle Sisters. So the early growth of the Cenacle, 4 pioneer sisters arrived from France in 1892 and they landed in New York City. In 1894, they opened the St. Regis Cenacle at 140th Street. The next Cenacle was Newport, Rhode Island in 1906. In 1907, they opened Charleston, South Carolina. In 1910, they opened Boston. And in 1920, they opened Chicago. So it's these latter 2 houses that are going to be very influential on the history of NLRM. So the beginnings of NLRM were retreat leagues that were founded under the guidance of the Cenacle Sisters. First in Boston in 1927, and then a few years later in Chicago in 1931. So these leagues were interested in promoting retreats among women, encouraging women and girls to attend retreats at the Cenacle. In Chicago, under the leadership of the retreat mistress, Sister Helen Clifford, they developed a captain system where various captains were in charge of recruiting a certain number of attendees for each retreat. This was based on a similar system used by laymen who attended retreats at the Malvern Retreat House in Philadelphia. I wanted to spend a moment talking about Sister Helen Clifford since she was such a big part of the history of NLRM. According to Alice Hunt, Sister Helen Clifford was a born leader and could make one believe that the impossible was possible. After her death in 1979, Sister Helen was remembered with great respect and fondness. One of her fellow Cenacle sisters, Sister Blanche Gannon, recalled, "The first time I saw Sister Clifford was in 1924 when I went to make a retreat at St. Regis. When we came up to register, we were startled and speechless, for we saw the most beautiful young sister helping with the registration. She was in the full habit, with the pinkest cheeks I have ever seen, beautiful eyes, and she was more like a picture than a real person. After my juniorate, I again met Sister Clifford in Chicago. She was guest mistress at 513 Fullerton and had a large group of women each week for a course. Besides this and her work as guest mistress, she had a guild, groups, etc. During retreat, she played the organ while I took the singing practice. With all her apostolic work, she never missed a half hour of adoration each day. People who came to see her were willing to wait while she prayed, for they knew that she was praying for them. I never met a person so busy with apostolic work, and yet she never omitted divine office. All those who came to the house simply loved her. The priests admired her immensely and were her good friends. The members of the community were the recipients of her kind help. She was the most kind and understanding member. It was a joy and a blessing to work with her. This is the woman who helped found NLRM." The meeting that birthed a movement. On May 11, 1936, with the approval of Chicago Superior Sister Edna Dupre, Sister Helen Clifford and some members of the Chicago Retreat League, who were Mary Gertrude Quirk of Milwaukee, Nell Harmon, Mildred McCauley, Della Linden, and Alice Hunt. And you may remember a couple of these names from the histories that were written. So these were foundational women who helped create the NLRM. So this group of intrepid women met with Father Valerius Nels, a Franciscan, who was the director of the Mays Lake Retreat House for Men in Hinsdale, Illinois. And the sisters knew him because he occasionally gave retreats at the Chicago Cenacle. But at the time when he met him, he was the executive secretary of the National Lay Men's Retreat Movement. And he brought along Daniel Morrissey, the newly elected president of the National Lay Men's Retreat Movement. They announced that the men's organization had scheduled a national conference at the Palmer House in Chicago for the weekend of June 27th through 28th, 1936. They suggested that a women's conference could be held at the same time. And the women who met with him all agreed. At the end of his persuasive speech, Father Valerius said, "Ladies, you have been midwives in the birth of the National Lay Women's Retreat Movement." The first conference in 1936. As soon as that meeting ended with Father Valerius, the Chicago Retreat League sprang into action under the leadership of Sister Helen Clifford. They sent out a survey to 100 dioceses asking for information about permanent and seasonal retreat houses, and they received reports of 22 permanent retreat houses and 78 seasonal ones. Letters were then sent to those in charge of these retreat houses in order to get attendees for the first conference. Mrs. Joseph Gleason was appointed the general chairman of the conference, and Mildred McCauley was chairman of the program committee. And with the help of various other committees of women, they prepared for the opening of the lay women's sessions on June 27, 1936, just 6 weeks after the initial meeting with Father Valerius. And some of the highlights of that first conference are that Sister Edna Dupre, Superior of the Chicago House at Fullerton, opened the conference. 851 people attended, representing 11 states and 11 retreat houses or groups. Some of the topics discussed were the retreat movement, the soul of Catholic action, why a closed retreat, awakening and sustaining enthusiasm in the retreat movement, and the retreat and personal holiness. Alice Hunt, who wrote in 1977, recalling an amusing anecdote from that first conference in 1936. We had for entertainment the famous Paulist Choir under the direction of Father O'Malley. Reservations poured in for the closing banquet. Father O'Malley insisted upon more and more tables to be removed so that the choir would have ample room. I stayed at the Palmer House the night before the banquet and worked all night arranging tables with Mildred McCauley helping me. With last-minute demands, we only had 2 banquet tickets left, and we were obliged to give ours up. We went up on the top of the balcony of the grand ballroom, practically near the roof, where we had our banquet dinner. We had a marvelous view looking down at the speakers and people attending. After dessert, Dan Morrissey, as Master of Ceremonies, introduced the various celebrities, and a light was flashed on each person where they were seated as they rose to take a bow. Then, to our utter horror, Dan Morrissey called on Mildred McCauley and myself. The light flashed all over the banquet floor, and finally we waved from the top balcony, and the floodlights were flashed to the ceiling where they spotted us. The whole audience burst into laughter, and it was really funny to see the 2 of us hanging over the balcony. And so concluded the first convention when we joined forces with the men. So the momentum continues after that first meeting. They established a continuing committee that was appointed and included a representative from each retreat house. Mary Gertrude Quirk of Milwaukee, Wisconsin was appointed chairman. Sister Helen Clifford of the Chicago Cenacle became the executive secretary. She was basically the communication hub for the group, as well as the coordinator of many of their activities. In 1937, the second national conference of NLRM was held in Boston, sponsored by the Boston Brighton Cenacle. And then subsequent conferences were also sponsored by Cenacles in New York City, in Newport, Rhode Island, in St. Louis, Missouri, in Wayzata, Minnesota, and in Metairie, Louisiana. But the Cenacles were not the only ones sponsoring these conferences. Retreat houses run by other congregations, such as the Dominican Sisters and the Sisters of Mary Reparatrix, as well as diocesan retreat houses, also sponsored conferences. Alice Hunt again recalls some of their early days. Our first years were difficult in getting the National Lay Women's Movement off the ground. We had no money and had to use our own resources for stationery, postage, phones, and even trips to the various houses to interest them in the movement. We set up a speakers bureau, and many of us went to the hinterlands and spoke at parish gatherings. One such I attended, where the meeting went on and on. The speaker before me was urging all to save their tin cans and grease drippings for lard collections at the various meat markets as a war effort. It was nearly midnight when I arose to give my talk at a time when everyone was so tired, all they wanted was to close the meeting and go home. The next meeting was in 1939, and it was sponsored by the Cenacle Sisters of New York City. That year, a constitution was adopted establishing NLRM as a permanent organization. And here you see a brochure produced for that meeting showing a little drawing of St. Regis, which is one of the sponsors of it. And at the 1939 conference, over 2,000 laywomen from 17 states, England, and Canada registered for the conference. And here you see the conference program, and the theme was Retreat and Build for the World of Tomorrow. And they got some endorsements from the press. Writing for the June 1939 issue of The Catholic World, Grace Hausman Sherwood praised the work of NLRM. A retreat is a priceless experience which it is the work of this Congress to make better known. Nor should the work of the Society of Our Lady of the Cenacle in this great movement be lost sight of for an instant. Sponsoring this Congress, as they did the others, Chicago in 1936 and Boston in 1937, sowing the seed, as we have seen, of the movement for retreats for women, everyone interested in its success should give these religious wholehearted support. Again, another brochure showing the retreat house in St. Regis. And there was a bit of a transition in 1939 as well. The second big figure of the Cenacle Sisters who had a hand in forming the organization was Sister Mary Shannon. And she took over in 1939 as the executive secretary, and she also took on the responsibility of editing the organization's newsletter called The Retreat World. So she took over for Sister Helen Clifford at this point. So I just wanted to spend a few moments talking about Sister Mary Shannon and what kind of person she was. She was known as a practical mystic. So after her death in Boston in 1957, Sister Mary Shannon was eulogized by her fellow Cenacle sister, Florence Murphy, who said, "To us she was a real Cenacle religious, a real daughter of Blessed Therese. She was the soul of charity, of silence, and of a deep interior life of prayer. She had a genius for organization, which she used to build up all the works of the Brighton Cenacle. She supported wholeheartedly any house activity launched for the promotion of the work of retreats or to raise money for the building fund. She attended immediately to any request of one of the religious or a retreatant for a favor or a service, without ever giving the impression of being burdened with work. She never kept anyone waiting. She began the work for the blind here in Boston, started the Chapel Guild, the Crusade of Prayer, later known as Prayer Enrollment, and the Retreatants Library. Our sisters and retreatants still speak of the wonderful instruction and doctrine she gave them for many years. Because she was so silent and collected, many had the impression that she was out of this world. She was anything but. One discovered on consulting her for advice or on getting her opinion on some matter, how au courant she was with all that was going on, both within the community and on the outside. She was one of those practical mystics who lived and worked in God, for God, and with God, giving all she had of herself for Him and for souls. So Sister Mary Shannon held her roles until 1948. She then retired from being the executive secretary and the editor of Retreat World. A lay woman, Della Linden of Chicago, took up those positions. Della Linden, you may recall, was one of the first members of the Retreat League who met up at the beginning in 1936 with Sister Helen Clifford and Father Valerius. So again, these names keep coming up because these were some of the foundational people. This retirement of Sister Mary Shannon marked a necessary shift in the organization. In 1953, Mildred Macaulay, a laywoman who was the NLRM president in 1937, wrote her collection of this transitional time. From the time of its inception, the retreat movement had been under the guidance of the hierarchy. Mother Clifford and Mother Shannon, as religious of the Cenacle and executive secretaries, prayed and gave direction, inspiration, enthusiasm, and tireless labor to the movement. They unified, encouraged expansion, and taught selfless devotedness in spreading the knowledge of retreats. NLRM could never adequately appreciate the great contribution of these two nuns. In 1948, Mother Shannon's resignation made the NLRM stand on its own as a laywomen's organization. Though Cenacle Sisters would never again take such an active role in organizational leadership, they of course still sent delegates to meetings and sponsored national congresses. These national conferences were held every 2 years until 1950, and then only every 3 years afterwards. The 10th National Congress was held in 1956 and was sponsored by the Cenacle Retreat House in Wayzata, Minnesota. Sister Mary Ruth, a Cenacle sister who attended from Boston, wrote about one of the highlights of the opening banquet. At the banquet, Bishop Wright spoke briefly, the chief speaker for the occasion being Maria Augusta Trapp, of the famous Trapp family singers who made a real hit. She thrilled everyone by her sincere religious appraisal of the retreat in the lives of women, and incidentally paid a nice tribute to the religious Cenacle whom she had visited in New Zealand, where she talked with Mother Dupre. Here we have a picture of one of the sisters welcoming the conference attendees, and a photo of the conference attendees on a train on their way to Wayzata. The 12th National Congress in 1962 marked the 25th anniversary of NLRM. It was hosted in Chicago, the very city where the first Congress was held in 1936. The meeting was sponsored by the Chicago area Cenacles. Here we see a newspaper clipping where it says Chicago to be women's retreat capital in August of 1962. Here we see a couple of interesting advertisements for the 1962 Congress. You have a Cenacle sister in the old habit with the purple cape, welcoming people to the Retreat Congress, and then an advertisement that says, your spiritual fitness program, a must for women, and then attend the National Retreat Congress. Here we see an invitation to this Jubilee, Silver Jubilee of the National Congress, of the National Lay Women's Retreat Movement. So it was quite the lavish event. Here we see women looking at the poster contest sponsored by the Congress. Lay people designed these posters to encourage women and girls to make a retreat, specifically a closed retreat. In the history of the movement, there had always been a focus on closed retreats. A closed retreat was defined as a period of 48 hours or more of unbroken residence in a retreat house while following the exercises of a retreat. NLRM took inspiration from Pope Pius XI and his 1929 encyclical Mens Nostra, where he said, "We wish particularly to insist on closed retreats. In these, one is more securely separated from creatures, and in the silence, the soul attends more closely to itself and God." Here we see a couple more posters from that same poster contest from 1962. One says, "Retreat. There is a great task waiting for women." And the second one, which is my favorite, says, "While all possess you, possess yourself. Make a closed retreat." The next Congress I want to talk about is the 14th. That was another one that was sponsored by the Cenacle Sisters. So the 14th NLRM Congress in New Orleans in 1968. The Metairie Cenacle sponsored the meeting, and the theme was Woman Renewed, World Renewed. At that meeting, Archbishop Leo Byrne said, "The lay retreat movement can do much in today's world to fulfill all our hopes for genuine renewal. Retreat houses should be centers of liturgical renewal, and this will lead modern men and women to an abundant Christian life." Sister Elizabeth Harris, Cenacle sister, was deeply involved in the planning and hosting of the meeting as the Congress coordinator. Here we see her in the front of one of the brochures. Here's a photo of her hard at work with the NLRM Conference Committee in 1968. And this is the welcome that Sister Elizabeth Harris wrote. During these 2 years of preparation, the selfless dedication of the committee chairmen and their workers has been an inspiration to us, as well as a clear indication of their high esteem of the closed retreat as a valuable means to holiness, and their zeal to open up to others this pearl of great price. We are looking forward to meeting you all and can assure you of a spiritually rewarding and happy time in the Deep South. Here we see a panel of speakers, and among them was Sister Margaret Byrne, a Cenacle sister. Sister Margaret Byrne, a native New Orleans, was a speaker on a panel addressing the topic, "The Woman to be Renewed, Psychological and Spiritual Aspects." At the time of the meeting, she was the provincial of the Midwest province of the Cenacle, was comprised of 10 retreat houses and the Philippine Mission. The 1968 Congress marked a bit of an end of an era for NLRM. The organization was evolving and changes were ahead. A name change happened in 1971. The delegates at the 15th National Congress, held in Los Angeles, voted to rename the organization to Retreats International Women's Division. The men's and women's divisions worked together to put on a convention in 1974 in Buffalo, New York. At that time, the women's division consisted of 60 retreat houses and leagues in the United States and one retreat house in Canada, as well as 1,000 individual members. More changes were to come. By 1977, the National Office of Retreats International Men's and Women's Divisions moved to the campus of the University of Notre Dame, and a full-time paid position of executive director was established, with the first person in the role to be Father Thomas Gideon, a Jesuit. A formal merger of the two organizations was planned for the July 1977 convention, and all members of the Women's Board agreed to remain active for the 1977 to 1980 term. So what is the current status of Retreats International? That is unclear. For the purposes of this presentation, I did not go too much farther than sort of the name change, because NLRM had changed into Retreats International, and the Cenacle Sisters' role in that organization was much more minimal. The most recent documentation that we have in our collection is from 2007. So the Cenacle Archives, we have documents from 2007, and then their Retreat International's papers have been deposited at the University of Notre Dame, and they have documents there from 1935 to 1980s. And I did do a quick web search, and I did not find a website for the current organization. I will close with a 1997 letter from Father Tom Gideon, the Executive Director of Retreats International, written to Cenacle Sister Rosemary Duncan. This letter, where he talks about doing research on the history of Retreats International, provides a great summary of the Cenacle Sisters and their role in NLRM. Here we can see a couple of artifacts from our collection. We have some pins with the NLRM logo, which is a dove. In his letter, Father Gideon writes, As I read further into the history, I was thrilled to read that the Sisters of the Cenacle were the originators, sustainers, and the organizers of the National Catholic Laywomen's Movement. For the first 10 years of its history, from 1935 to 1955, all the conventions were Cenacle enterprises. Much of the correspondence originates from the Cenacle. Your community was the inspiration of lay retreats in the early part of the century, and you have accompanied it these many years since. We salute you and we thank you for your many gifts to the spirituality of the current church.